Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, you check the news, and you discover that 13% of the world's daily energy supply has simply vanished.
Yeah, literally just disappeared overnight.
Right, the taps are completely dry, cargo ships are halted, and the global crude network is hemorrhaging millions of barrels a day. So you log into your retirement account, bracing yourself for absolute carnage, and, well, you see that the stock market is actually climbing.
Which, I mean, it looks like a glaring error in the financial system, just a complete detachment of asset prices from the physical reality of the global economy.
Exactly, and that bizarre detachment is exactly the reality we are currently inhabiting. Our mission for today's deep dive is to map out the hidden gears of this crisis. So we're pulling apart a comprehensive April 2026 report by Dr. Fareed Novin.
Published in the Global Review.
Right. And Dr. Novin provides this incredibly meticulous structural analysis of the cascading socioeconomic fallout from the ongoing U.S., Israel, and Iran conflict.
Yeah, and looking strictly at the economic mechanics in Dr. Novin's report. I mean, stripping away all the partisan politics, the military judgments, and the whole geopolitical blame game of who is right or wrong here, the physical math of the global supply chain is just completely terrifying.
It really is. And just setting the stage for that physical math, the report centers on the fallout from February 28th, 2026.
The inciting incident.
Right. The U.S. and Israel launched surprise airstrikes against Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure, which was an operation dubbed Epic Fury. And in immediate response, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz.
And that closure is what fundamentally pulled the rug out from under the global energy market. What's really fascinating here is that the International Energy Agency, the IEA, formally designated this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
The largest in history. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at a physical loss of 10.1 million barrels per day in March alone. The sheer scale of that dislocation requires us to completely discard our historical reference points. You know, when people hear oil shock, they instinctively default to the 1973 OPEC embargo.
Right, but the critical difference being that the 1973 crisis was a political embargo, wasn't it?
Exactly. It withheld roughly 4 to 5 million barrels a day, so about 7% of global supply, but the infrastructure itself remained perfectly intact.
So a political embargo can basically be undone overnight with a diplomatic handshake and a new treaty.
Right, but Dr. Novin emphasizes that 2026 is an infrastructure crisis. We are dealing with literal sea mines strewn across navigable waters. We have destroyed port facilities, shattered maritime insurance markets, and, over 200 fully loaded tankers are just stranded at sea.
Because you can't just sign a treaty to magically vaporize a sea mine or rebuild a shattered crude terminal.
No, you can't. The barrier to resuming normal trade right now is physical engineering, not just political willpower.
Which introduces this massive contradiction, because if we lost over 10 million barrels of physical oil a day in March, the price of Brent crude should have immediately skyrocketed to $150 a barrel and just stayed there.
Yeah. But instead, the market absorbed the blow with surprising initial complacency.
Right.
Why is that? Well, the gap between that physical destruction and the market's subdued reaction comes down to a strategy of rhetorical market intervention, which is widely known as jawboning.
Okay, let's unpack this. Jawboning is essentially an attempt by policymakers to talk the market into submission. Dr. Novin's report details how U.S. officials, and specifically President Trump, used social media to aggressively project that a swift, decisive military resolution was imminent.
Exactly.
It kind of reminds me of a parent counting to 3 to get a kid to behave,
Yeah.
It only works if there's an actual consequence at 3.
That is a perfect analogy. The strategy relies heavily on exploiting the financial market's desperation for a quick return to the status quo. So traders hear the confident rhetoric, they assume the physical disruption is a temporary blip, and they price in a rapid resolution.
So it actually worked initially.
It did. According to the data tracked by Dr. Novin, the combination of aggressive social media pacing and the coordinated release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves actually managed to artificially bind Brent crude between $90 and $120 a barrel for several weeks.
But rhetoric can't power a cargo ship, right? At what point did the market realize the emperor had no clothes? Because eventually those strategic reserves start to run dry.
Right, and the sea mines are still physically blocking the strait. The mechanism of jawboning has a strict expiration date. Dr. Novin points out that the U.S. drained its rhetorical buffer through compounding failed deadlines. The breakdown of that trust is probably the most fascinating technical dynamic in the early stages of this conflict.
Yeah, the report highlights those two critical fakeouts in April.
Right, so on April 8th, an imminent temporary ceasefire was signaled. The financial markets absolutely celebrated. Algorithmic trading systems bought into the relief rally, oil dropped 10 to 12%, and a victory message was posted on U.S. social media.
But then, within a matter of hours, Iranian gunboats were actively firing on tankers attempting to navigate the strait.
Exactly. And then that cycle repeated itself almost identically on April 17th.
Right. The Iranian foreign minister signaled the strait was open, the trading algorithms dumped the price of oil, and by Saturday morning, the gunboats were firing again.
But Dr. Novin's analysis suggests this wasn't just diplomatic clumsiness. Iran was actively weaponizing the U.S. administration's reliance on social media announcements.
Wait, really? How so?
They basically turned global geopolitics into an algorithmic arbitrage instrument. I mean, modern energy markets are heavily driven by high-frequency trading systems.
Right. Those algorithms that scrape natural language from newswires and social media feeds to execute trades in fractions of a second.
Exactly. So Iran recognized that the U.S. was determined to project control. By dropping a vaguely conciliatory statement, they knew U.S. officials would amplify it to calm the markets. The algorithms would read the sentiment, instantly drive the price of oil down, and then Iran would physically strike a vessel, causing a massive volatility spike.
Oh, wow. So they were effectively day trading the conflict. They exploited the financial market's algorithmic sensitivity to extract maximum diplomatic chaos.
All while proving that U.S. rhetoric had zero correlation with physical safety in the water. And because Jawboning utterly failed to clear the strait, that whole rhetorical phase collapsed entirely.
Which pushed the conflict into direct, overt economic warfare.
Exactly. That physical escalation materialized in mid-April. On April 13th, the United States initiated a comprehensive naval blockade of Iranian ports. They deployed an amphibious group, 11 destroyers, and the USS Abraham Lincoln.
Which stands as the largest operation of its kind since the Korean War.
It's massive. And Iran's counter-move was to formally declare the blockade an act of war, and they permanently closed the Strait of Hormuz to Western shipping.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because Iran didn't seal the waterway to everyone.
No, they didn't. Novin's report highlights this brilliant asymmetric loophole. They instituted a highly sophisticated transit toll system, charging up to $2 million per vessel, but strictly limited to ships from the Global South and Eastern Bloc.
So specifically countries like China, Russia, India, and Pakistan.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this fundamentally fractures the rules-based international maritime order. I mean, for nearly a century, the foundational premise of global trade has been universal freedom of navigation.
Right. And now we are witnessing a state actor successfully carving up an international waterway into a privatized, discriminatory toll road.
And China's position here is just a masterclass in exploiting geopolitical gray zones. They rely on the Strait of Hormuz for about a third of their crude oil imports.
So by willingly paying these exorbitant $2 million transit fees, Beijing is pumping massive amounts of capital directly into the Iranian war effort.
Right, they are effectively subsidizing the blockade against the West. And they're doing all of this while hiding behind a diplomatic shield of plausible neutrality.
Wow. And the integration of Pakistan as a diplomatic intermediary further complicates the U.S. position, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Pakistan has been flying Iranian delegations around and urging the U.S. to stand down. Major global players are structurally adapting to the blockade. They are quietly building workarounds rather than confronting Iran.
Which leaves the U.S. enforcing a blockade that half the world is actively and profitably ignoring.
Exactly.
So the geopolitics of the water are rapidly shifting, but the cargo on those ships is where this crisis really touches the everyday lives of the public. Up to this point, we've focused heavily on crude oil, but Dr. Novin's report makes it explicitly clear that the Strait of Hormuz is not just an artery for petroleum.
No, it is a critical choke point for a vast web of industrial chemicals and agricultural feedstocks. This brings us to what the report terms the multi-commodity cascade.
Okay, let's dive into that. Walk us through this cascade.
Well, liquefied natural gas, or LNG, is the first domino to fall. Roughly 20% of global LNG transits through Hormuz. On March 18th, an attack severely damaged Qatar's export infrastructure, taking 17% of their gas export capacity offline.
And unlike crude oil, which can sometimes be loaded onto smaller vessels or pushed through emergency terrestrial pipelines, LNG is a completely different logistical challenge, right?
Completely different. You need massive, highly specialized cryogenic export terminals. You can't just easily reroute gas through a standard pipeline, and as a result, European natural gas prices have spiked 70%.
And that cryogenic requirement is the exact mechanism that triggers the next major supply chain crisis, which is helium.
Yeah, it is easy to overlook helium as just some niche byproduct for party balloons, but Novin points out it is an absolute linchpin for modern medical and tech infrastructure.
Because natural gas must be super cooled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit to become liquid, right? And that intense cooling process is the exact moment when helium separates out and is captured.
Right, so by taking Qatar's LNG facilities offline, the conflict inadvertently shut off roughly one-third of the global helium valve. Helium distributors are already instituting strict rationing protocols.
So to connect this directly to you, the listener, this isn't an abstract commodities issue. This translates immediately to delays for MRI machines at your local hospital because they can't cool the superconducting magnets.
Right, and severe operational bottlenecks in semiconductor manufacturing plants. The technology and healthcare sectors are suddenly hostage to a naval standoff in the Persian Gulf.
It's unbelievable, but then we have to examine the agricultural layer, which is arguably the most alarming section of Dr. Novin's analysis.
Oh, without a doubt. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for the Haber-Bosch process, which is the chemical procedure used to synthesize ammonia and urea.
And the Persian Gulf region historically exports up to 35% of the global supply of these vital nitrogen fertilizers.
Yeah, so the disruption to Qatari gas triggered an immediate severe contraction in fertilizer production. The report tracks a 50% surge in global urea prices over a mere 6-week period.
Translating that to the physical agricultural calendar reveals a pretty grim timeline because the spring 2026 planting season in the Northern Hemisphere is already deeply compromised by these fertilizer shortages.
Right, and when corn and wheat yields drop, the cost of feeding cattle, poultry, and dairy cows skyrockets.
Which guarantees massive structural grocery price shocks stretching well into late 2027. We are also seeing petrochemical disruptions cascading down to the most basic consumer goods, like manufacturers running out of the specialized plastics required for pill blister packs.
We are tracking an industrial cascade that begins with a sea mine in the Persian Gulf and ends with empty pharmacy shelves and unaffordable beef in your local supermarket.
Which brings us back to the core disconnect we opened with. I mean, we have fractured supply chains, looming food crises, medical rationing, and warships firing on commercial vessels. Yet, the S&P 500 is up 4.3% this year.
Right.
It feels like Wile E. Coyote running off the edge of a cliff. The market is suspended in midair simply because it hasn't linked down yet.
I love that analogy. Financial strategists in the report refer to this phenomenon as the COVID analogy.
Oh, like back in the spring of 2020.
Exactly. If you recall spring 2020, equity markets staged a rapid V-shaped recovery driven by massive government liquidity and monetary intervention. The stock market rebounded while physical supply chains worldwide were quietly rotting due to lockdowns and port closures.
So the financial markets priced in the immediate government rhetoric, but the actual physical hangover, the entrenched stagflation, the labor shortages, the missing semiconductor chips that didn't hit the real economy until 12 to 18 months later.
And that is precisely what is happening now. The equities market today is aggressively pricing in a social media-driven political resolution. Traders are betting that the sheer economic pain of this blockade will force a rapid diplomatic settlement.
So what does this all actually mean? Because Dr. Novin lays out 3 specific scenarios for how this ends, and none of them involve a magical quick fix.
No, they don't. The baseline expectation driving current market optimism. So, scenario A, a rapid negotiated settlement, is assigned only a 20 to 25% probability. And even if they sign a settlement soon, the timeline for normalization stretches late into 2026.
Right, because of the physical constraints. Specialized maritime crews have to clear unmapped sea mines, structural engineers have to rebuild cryogenic LNG terminals, and the insurance markets have to completely reprice the shipping risk.
Exactly. Normalization is largely a myth at this stage. The infrastructure damage guarantees a prolonged drag on global growth.
So if a quick fix is off the table, what is scenario B?
Scenario B is the highest probability, sitting at 50 to 55%, a protracted impasse. Talks stall indefinitely, Iran successfully institutionalizes its selective toll system, and Brent crude breaks firmly above $115 a barrel.
And the fertilizer shock fully materializes by the third quarter of 2026.
Right. And under this protracted scenario, the report explicitly states that G7 economies will be forced into severe demand management.
And demand management is just the polite, bureaucratic phrasing for government-mandated energy and food rationing. It means interventions dictating how much fuel logistics companies can use, or heavy restrictions on industrial power consumption.
Which is sobering. And we cannot ignore scenario C, the tail risk. Novin assigns a 20 to 25% probability to renewed, uncontrolled escalation.
Which involves Iran expanding attacks to other regional choke points, or the U.S. significantly expanding its military operations inland, right?
Yeah, and under that scenario, crude oil surges to between $150 and $200 a barrel, making a severe, synchronized global recession a mathematical certainty.
Wow. So the ultimate takeaway from Dr. Novin's analysis is that the era of effective job owning has officially concluded. The illusion that Western policymakers can simply tweet their way out of physical supply crunches has been completely shattered.
Absolutely. The strategic petroleum reserves are nearly exhausted, and alternative pipelines are maxed out.
The G7 faces an urgent mandate to stop projecting the false hope of an imminent return to the old normal. They need to pivot their entire strategy toward preparing the public for an extended period of physical resilience, sustained frugality, and entrenched inflation.
It is a fundamental rewiring of the global operating system. The international maritime laws that guaranteed cheap, frictionless trade for decades are being dismantled and replaced by state-imposed toll-based access.
So for you listening, whether you are tracking global markets or just buying your weekly groceries, this is not just a distant geopolitical event. You are witnessing a structural global transition happening under extreme duress. It is fundamentally altering maritime law and quietly rewriting everyday supply chains. The coyote has run off the cliff, and the fall is coming.
Which raises an incredibly important question, one not explicitly resolved in the discussion, but vital to consider.
What's that?
If a single 34-kilometer choke point halfway across the world has the power to dictate the cost of your groceries and ground the global economy, is the era of deeply interconnected, hyper-centralized global supply chains officially obsolete? As you go about your day, consider whether the future of economic security lies not in bigger trade routes, but in a radical pivot toward localized, unshakable self-sufficiency.